It's starting to get suffocatingly hot in this cramped little space under the jewelry display carts. The cold metal of the cart is pressing into the woman's back, but she waits. She has to. There isn't really any other choice. She strains her ears, trying to listen to what is going on in the world outside of underneath the cart, while being as still as possible, sweat burning her eyes as it streams down her face. Every single time the wind blows, she worries that the colorful curtains surrounding the jewelry cart will shift, expose her, and give her hiding spot away to the men who had pulled up in several vehicles minutes ago outside the mall. Just 24 hours ago, the Taliban announced brand new mandatory rules for how a woman must wear a hijab in public. In Afghanistan, these rules have been changing constantly, becoming harsher, with terrifying consequences for the women who can't keep up. As soon as the woman who is currently hiding under the cart heard of this change, she and her mother rushed to the market. They had to buy a chadar, a loose, full-body covering, to satisfy the new law. But it seems as though she might already be too late. Because just as they had been standing right there by a vendor's cart, trying to buy the fabric that would keep her safe, those vehicles pulled up at lightning speed. Not too fast for Mom to push her into that hiding spot, though. The men in these vehicles are from the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, the morality police. The woman can now hear the faint sound of her mother desperately haggling with the vendor. Suddenly, she hears her mom softly calling her name from the chaos of the panicking crowd. She carefully crawls out from under the cart, and before she can even look up, a heavy, black fabric, patterned with flowers, is thrown over her head. At that very moment, she feels immense relief, because she has just quite literally been saved from enduring a Taliban prison. Her mother, gasping for breath, whispers, "Fix it. Move. Let's go." They are inside the restaurants right now, dragging out those who don't have one. They barely escaped that day. And this isn't the last time she is targeted either. You see, this woman is a freelance reporter, writing under a fake name for her own survival. The very next day, she puts on full veil and goes back out into the streets of Herat. She wants to see what is happening to the women of her land. She gets into a shared taxi, later recalling that the atmosphere was suffocating. Every woman inside is covered, wearing medical masks to hide their faces, whispering and cursing the regime. One woman looks at her and says, "We have been buried alive." On her way home, her three-wheeler taxi violently jerks to a stop at an intersection. A Taliban guard rips the door open, looks at her, and tells her to get out. She protests, "Why? I am wearing the hijab." The guard screams at her, calling her an infidel, a whore, an immoral woman. He demands to know where her mahram, her male guardian, is. He scolds her for sitting alone with a male taxi driver, chastising her that Satan would tempt her. Now really think about how terrifying these encounters would be, the psychological toll they would take day in and day out, the searing heat, the trauma, and the constant terror. Something inside this woman finally breaks. She doesn't look down. She stares directly into this man's soulless eyes, feeling any sense of control slipping away. She gets out of the vehicle and yells, "Satan is better than you. You have made people hate religion. They will put me in one grave, and they will put you in another. I swear to God, if anyone comes toward me, I will hurt myself right here." The guard seems completely stunned. The crowd of bystanders stop, staring with angry, burning eyes at the Taliban member. The air is thick with tension. The guard tells her that they are taking her to the directorate, but she refuses to get into their vehicle. She turns around and simply starts walking home under the burning sun. And because of the sheer anger of the crowd backing her up, the guard actually backs down. Against all odds, he lets her walk away. She makes it home, but her body completely collapses from the sheer trauma and also heat stroke. She ends up in a clinic on an IV drip. And for a third time, within the span of a few days, she comes directly into contact with the Taliban as she is leaving a clinic at midnight on a motorcycle with her actual brother. The Taliban force them off of the bike. They interrogate her brother and demand she recite the names of her father and her grandfather just to prove family relations before letting them go into the night. When we look at Afghanistan from the outside, it is so easy to fall into the trap of abstract politics that can be challenging for a Westerner to understand. Also, a post-colonial savioristic mindset is something we're kind of taught growing up, so it can be difficult to ignore that when it comes to other cultures. But I'm asking you to do that here. However, that doesn't mean excusing a culture's harmful treatment of women. What is playing out in the situation I described is the reality for Afghan women and girls in the present day. A shifting maze of survival where even an inch of exposed skin or a ride home from the hospital can cost you your freedom and quite possibly your life. And it raises many questions, doesn't it? How did this happen? How are women being treated as though they are illegal in and of themselves? Was it always this way? Were women in Kabul wearing miniskirts in the early 60s and 70s, as people like to suggest through photographs on social media? And is it the Taliban's extreme, unfair interpretation of Sharia law that is forcing Afghan women to live like some dirty secret in their own land? I will do my best to answer these questions with deep respect for the culture, but also through an absolutely unapologetic feminist lens. But brace yourselves, because if you only look at the history of the ruling governments, the invading empires, and the militarized factions who have fought over this land, you will find a landscape utterly dominated by men and worse men. But that isn't the whole story, because on the streets, away from the palaces, there is resistance. People taking risks and trying to make change. This episode is about survival, huge class differences, and the hypocrisy of patriarchy. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. If you hear this story and you want to make a difference, there is a way that you can help get the situation in Afghanistan recognized by the EU and UN for what it is: gender apartheid. In the show notes, there are 2 petitions by journalist and activist Bakhtash Siawash that you can sign in order to help finally make this problem official. There is also a link to an account called AFG Unseen, which makes artwork to try to show what women and girls of Afghanistan experience. And in addition to that, I will leave a few links to contribute to getting help to women in Afghanistan. Content warning: there will be heavy discussions of sexual assault and child sexual assault, amongst other heavy topics. Use discretion when listening. That being said, let's get into it. The year is 1996. A man is standing at the Sarubi Dam, a narrow valley that acts as an impregnable natural fortress, guarding the road to Kabul. Alongside him are 1,800 battle-hardened fighters, loyal to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an infamous warlord known as the Butcher of Kabul. The man standing at the dam is heavily armed and waiting for the Taliban to crest the horizon. Then they appear. But it's not a typical military charge the Taliban is executing. The first line of the Taliban convoy is completely unarmed. They are young religious students wearing stark white turbans, clothed in white shrouds, walking forward and hugging copies of the Quran tightly to their chests. White is Islamically symbolic of spiritual purity, peace, and dedication. A white shroud is traditionally worn by deceased Muslims. Right behind this ghostly white vanguard is a second line. These men are wearing green and black turbans, and their assault rifles are raised and ready. As they march, the entire formation is chanting Allahu Akbar, not in an aggressive shout, but in a haunting, melodic tune, perfectly in time with the beating of drums. The message is terrifyingly clear. Submit to the rule of the Quran, or the men in the green and black turbans will come for you. The front line of men also sent 2 conflicting messages, by design of course. One of peace, and one of martyrdom. If you are a fighter standing on that dam, the psychological effect is paralyzing. Ayman Dean, the former jihadist turned MI6 spy, and the man who watched the Taliban sweep over Kabul, recalled looking at the advancing white turbans and realizing, I can't shoot at that. And it seems as though he wasn't alone in this feeling. Hekmatyar's battle-hardened warriors, men who had ruthlessly fought the Soviets decades prior, and also each other for years, simply dropped their weapons. Instead of firing, their mouths started joining the Taliban in the repetitious, trance-like chanting of Allahu Akbar. They were overcome by the literal fear of God, and they turned and ran. Even the greatest warlords fled Kabul without firing a single bullet. This theatrical sweeping motion wasn't just religious fervor. It is actually a calculated military strategy that analysts call the Taliban's operational art. Operational art is the blueprint of a military campaign, translating an overarching goal into tactical actions on the battlefield. And the Taliban's operational art relies heavily on psychological war theater. They know that morale and the will to fight are the most critical aspects of war. By placing the holy book on the front lines, they practiced a sophisticated psychological warfare designed to completely undermine enemy cohesion. They kind of paralyze the enemy's mind so that the battle is won before a single shot is even fired. This is also the exact same strategy they used to retake Afghanistan with lightning speed in 2021. According to experts, they are masters of the art of psychological terror. Today, the men who perfected this operational art are the undisputed rulers of Afghanistan, and they seem to reserve their most brutal psychological and physical warfare for the women of Afghanistan. I felt it was necessary to provide a description of the tactics that the Taliban use in order to take over cities in record-breaking time. I mean, it's really just a cheap, while very effective, parlor trick, if you think about it. Weaponizing religion in order to conquer. The Taliban's actions since regaining power in 2021 are important in understanding the current situation for women in Afghanistan right now. We first, however, have to discuss how things developed into what they have become, and for that, we have to go back towards the beginning. Because as we will soon see, life for women in Afghanistan has been historically complex and nuanced, pendulating dramatically between urban reform and rural backlash in the last half of the century. So, historians often call Afghanistan the crossroads of Asia, a massive roundabout on the ancient Silk Road where the world's greatest empires collided and merged into each other. Everyone from Alexander the Great to the Persian Empire to Genghis Khan marched their armies into these mountains, and unlike later empires, they actually conquered and stayed. In fact, over 2,000 years later, locals still refer to Alexander as Iskandar. But while the history books are obsessed with the men of these empires, they pretty much completely ignore the women who were navigating life here. Back then, on the macro level, women's bodies were treated as geopolitical currency. When Alexander the Great showed up to Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan, he did fight, yes, but he also married a Bactrian princess named Roxana. But look, I'm not going to tell you it was some epic fairy tale. Think of it like later situations, Pocahontas, Malintzin, you get the drift, where history books gave us bullshit accounts of beautiful, willing romances. We now know all of these accounts to be the cold propaganda of colonization, and also calculated political strategy, amongst other more nefarious things. Marrying Roxana was Alexander's way of securing an alliance to pacify the local tribes. But, plot twist, while Roxana was handed over as a diplomatic peace offering, the culture she came from didn't actually treat free women as slaves or property. In ancient Bactria, once a woman became the lady of the house, she held massive domestic and legal authority. Unlike classical Athens, where women were literally locked away in the back of the house with zero rights, a free Bactrian woman could own property, sign business contracts, and legally forbid her husband from taking a second wife. She was used as a bargaining chip to start a marriage, but once inside it, she had protections. But I digress. Over the centuries, through wave after wave of empires coming and going, those freedoms began to slowly erode, and tribal honor codes gained power. This is where the practice of Ba'ad comes into the picture. Ba'ad is a traditional extrajudicial tribal practice used primarily among rural communities. But back then, everywhere was kind of rural. This was to settle blood feuds, disputes, or crimes like murder and theft. Instead of using a court of law, the perpetrator's family hands over a young daughter or sister to the victim's family as compensation. This practice treats the girl as an object of financial and blood debt, forcing her into horrible situations like forced marriages and a lifetime of systematic abuse within a very hostile household to pay for the actions of a male relative. Another structural symptom of this extreme patriarchy and a direct consequence of completely segregating women out of everyday public life is the horrific practice of bakabatsi, literally translating to boy play in Pashto. This is a centuries-old custom of child sexual exploitation, prevalent across Central Asia and the historical Persianate world. Under this practice, wealthy elites, commanders, and warlords target vulnerable, impoverished young boys, often through kidnapping or financial coercion. These children are robbed of their freedom, forced into feminine clothing to dance at private gatherings of men, and subjected to sexual abuse. Within this feudal type of society, the practice operates as a public status symbol, used by powerful men to explicitly demonstrate their wealth, authority, and capacity for total dominance over others. Now, though the Pashtuns who adhere to the tribal code of Pashtunwali are the group of people most often spoken about in regards to Afghanistan, it's important to note that there were and are many different ethnic groups residing in these areas. The largest of these groups are the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras. An example of how one of these groups came to exist is when Genghis Khan's Mongol horsemen swept through the region in the 1200s, leaving a distinct genetic and cultural lineage that can be traced directly to the Hazara people of today. It is the Pashtuns, however, that we will be focusing on most during these episodes, along with their customary tribal code, Pashtunwali. This code is not only the dominant cultural practice in the rural South and East, but it also forms the foundational baseline for the modern ideology of the Taliban. As centuries of warfare ground down the region, the practice of young women being treated as the property of male guardians became the norm. Your father owned you. He eventually sold you to a husband for a bride price, which is called a walwar. And your entire existence was bound to a strict code of family honor. If you stepped outside of that line, it meant death. Yet despite being stripped of the autonomy they once held, rural women still found ways to push back against this total subjugation. Their resistance did not take form of public protests or anything like that, which would have been kind of impossible in that time period anyway. But instead, they used an ancient, anonymous oral poetry tradition called landais. Derived from the Pashto word literally meaning short poisonous snake, landais are a precise two-line folk poem consisting of exactly 22 syllables, 9 in the first line, 13 in the second. For centuries, women secretly composed, memorized, and passed down these poems. Because they were entirely anonymous, they allowed women to voice forbidden truths, deep grief, and rage against abusive husbands, forced marriages, and the trading of their bodies without fear of punishment at all. These poems were strictly a collective female activity. Women shared and sang them in safe spaces, completely hidden from the patriarchal gaze, while doing laundry together at the riverbanks or fetching water, or even gathering for embroidery work. While the male-dominated historical narrative records these women as silent and submissive, their oral history tells a completely different story. The following is a landai addressing the brutal reality of a young girl forced into marriage with an old man for a high bride price. Cruel people who see how an old man leads me to his bed, and you ask why I weep and tear out my hair. Another exposes the financial exploitation of daughters by the very family members who were supposed to protect them. When sisters sit together, they always praise their brothers. When brothers sit together, they sell their sisters to others. Through these verses, rural women maintained a continuous underground type of rebellion against the tribal laws of the land. We know these secret histories today because of journalists like Eliza Griswold, who traveled into areas of Afghanistan to record and translate these poems for the Poetry Foundation, preserving a history that male authorities tried for centuries to keep silent. And the women didn't just target abusive husbands or greedy family members in their poems. They also aimed their words directly at the religious leaders who enforced their seclusion. In Pashtun society, the village mullah held absolute moral authority over what a woman could wear and where she could go. But the women saw right through this religious performance. One landai exposes this exact hypocrisy, mocking the very tribal priests who demanded their modesty. You order me to cover myself, mullah, yet you look at me out of the corner of your eye. Here are a few other landais that I found interesting. My lover wants to keep my tongue inside his mouth, not for the delight of it, but only to establish his steady rights on me. Oh, rooster, wait a little with your song. I have just come into my lover's arms. Gently slide your hand inside my sleeves. The pomegranates of Kandahar have blossomed and they are ripe. My friend, which of these two to choose? Mourning and exile arrived at my door together. See the dreadful tyranny of husbands. He beats me and then forbids my weeping. Now, what makes these landais so powerful is their fluid adaptability throughout time. Because it is a purely oral tradition, women seamlessly remixed the words to weaponize them against whoever was oppressing them at the time. Before the foreign invasions, a woman might sing a couplet mourning a forced marriage or cursing the high bride price that sold her off like livestock. But when the British Empire marched into the mountains during the 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, the poetry shifted a bit. Women sang verses damning the foreign soldiers and mocking any Afghan man too cowardly to fight them. Decades later, during King Zahir Shah's reign, the words adapted yet again, shifting back inward to lament the misery of being stuck in a remote mud brick compound while the men left the villages to look for work in the distant cities. The empires and people in power changed, but the landais remained an unbroken chain of a kind of secret history, perfectly revamped to match the exact situation each generation found themselves in. So, it was in this landscape of strict tribal codes and secret female resistance that, around the 7th century, the religion of Islam began making its way into the region. This happened through successive Arab conquests, finally solidifying and taking deep root by the 10th century. To put it simply here, the Quran is to Islam what the Holy Bible is to Christianity, the foundational, sacred written text that dictates the laws and morals of the faith. And before we go any further, though, it is critical to get the vocabulary right. A person who practices the religion of Islam is a Muslim. they are not an Islamist. An Islamist is not a regular person practicing a faith. They are a modern political ideologue who wants to force an entire society to be governed by a fundamentalist, authoritarian version of religious law. It is the difference between an everyday Christian practicing their faith and a radical Christian nationalist trying to seize control of a government. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are not simply Muslims. They are heavily armed political Islamists using religion as a weapon to rule by force. So anyway, the historical reality of how the practice of Islam actually functioned on the ground in Afghanistan isn't truly Islam. In the West, modern perceptions of Islamic scripture are deeply skewed. People are constantly misled into believing the text itself encourages atrocities or absolute oppression. But the reality is that tribal leaders back then did exactly what extremists do now. They ignored the book to protect their own power. Because the written text of the Quran explicitly outlawed the practice of ba'ad, strictly prohibited the sexual exploitation of children, and granted women distinct legal rights, including the right to inherit property and to refuse a forced marriage. Also, Islamic scripture explicitly states that the pursuit of knowledge and education is a mandatory religious duty for all Muslims, making absolutely no distinction between men and women. But a text can only provide guidance if the people can read it. Because of Afghanistan's incredibly rugged geography, which left rural valleys completely isolated, coupled with near-total systemic illiteracy, the vast majority of the population could not read the Arabic text of the Quran for themselves. They relied entirely on local feudal lords and village religious leaders to interpret the faith for them. This allowed the rural ruling class to ignore parts of the Quran that threatened their money or their power, blending the religions seamlessly in with their ancient tribal codes like Pashtunwali. Over the centuries, the written theology of the text was effectively overwritten by the unwritten customs of the tribes, until the two became completely indistinguishable to the people living under them. But when the rest of the world started to change in the early 20th century, Afghanistan did too. Let's skip ahead to 1919. This is the year women in Sweden got the right to vote. And Afghan women got it around the same time. In fact, they beat American women to the ballot box by a full year. And although the women over in Great Britain gained partial voting rights in 1918, it took them until 1928 to get full voting rights. Okay, so the question is, how did that happen in a place governed by strict tribal codes? Well, it came down to a progressive Pashtun king named Amanullah Khan and his wife, Queen Soraya Tarzi. And by the way, it's worth noting here that the Pashtuns basically held a monopoly over the Afghan throne for centuries previous and centuries to come. And not only because there were more of them in the population. But then how did the Pashtuns get this monopoly in the first place? Why didn't a Tajik, a Hazara, or an Uzbek become the first king of Afghanistan? So, it comes down to a chaotic incident in 1747. Before Afghanistan was its own country, the area was dominated by the Persian Empire, ruled by a brutal military genius named Nader Shah. Now, Nader Shah didn't trust his own Persian soldiers, so he hired a highly disciplined, elite personal guard of 4,000 Pashtun cavalry riders. And the commander of that guard was a young Pashtun fighter named Ahmad Khan. In June of 1747, Nader Shah's own officers grew tired of his tyranny and assassinated him right in his tent. The empire instantly began to fall apart and chaos broke out. But while everyone else was panicking, Ahmad Khan and his Pashtun riders did something kind of wild. They occupied the entire imperial treasury and seized a massive caravan of looted gold, silver, and jewels, including the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond. All of a sudden, this Pashtun commander had 4,000 elite, heavily armed warriors and more money than God. He rode straight back to Kandahar and called a yirga, which is a grand tribal council. He used that mountain of stolen imperial wealth to buy the loyalty of the other rival Pashtun clans. He basically told them to stop fighting each other and follow him, and that he would use his money and army to conquer the surrounding lands, and they would all get rich together. The end. Anyway, they crowned him king, and he changed his name to Ahmad Shah Durrani. Durrani means pearl of pearls, if I'm not mistaken here. Now, why couldn't the Tajiks or Uzbeks stop him, or even the Hazaras? Because geography had divided them, is why. The Tajiks were urban traders and farmers. They didn't have a massive unified tribal army. The Uzbeks were far to the north, divided into their own independent kingdoms. And the Hazaras were completely decentralized from one another. The Pashtuns, packed into the southern and eastern mountains, now had the perfect combination of a massive population, a unified tribal code, an elite cavalry, and a vault full of stolen Persian gold. Ahmad Shah Durrani took his army and conquered the northern territories, bringing the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras under his power. He established a system where the Pashtuns were the ruling military class, and everyone else was a mere taxed subject. That right there in 1747 is how the royal Pashtun lineage was formed. The Pashtuns kind of basically bought the throne with Persian gold and secured it with the threat of military power. So to the other ethnic groups living there, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras, the ruling royalty in Kabul often felt less like a unified government and more like usurpers who took over the entire land. Now back to 1919. The young King Amanullah took the throne after his father, Emir Habibullah Khan, an autocratic ruler who introduced modern luxuries to his palace, but not to the country itself, was assassinated. Habibullah's approach to ruling the country had managed to alienate everyone. He spent massive amounts of state wealth importing steam engines, building private hydroelectric plants just to light up his palaces in Kabul and Jalalabad, and driving around in imported British automobiles on private royal roadways. Meanwhile, just a few miles outside the palace, there were virtually no paved roads connecting major provincial areas, and trade was still entirely dependent on donkey and camel caravans struggling over mountain passes because basic bridges hadn't been built. The local populations saw zero benefit from the modernization their taxes were funding. So, after taking the throne, Amanullah immediately launched the third and final Anglo-Afghan War, a swift and decisive effort to permanently kick out this last attempt British imperial occupation and claim Afghanistan's independence. He created the first constitution of Afghanistan as well. He and his wife, Queen Soraya, wanted to show the world that Afghanistan was a modern, enlightened nation. And they tried to do more than just giving women the right to vote. Queen Soraya opened the very first school for girls in Kabul. She founded the country's first women's magazine. And at a huge public event, King Amanullah literally stood up and said, Islam does not require women to cover their faces, and Queen Soraya tore off her veil right there in public. They also banned forced marriages and made laws to stop men from buying child brides. Sounds really good, am I right? But while acknowledging all the great they did in the country, there is a massive catch here, and this is where the class element comes into play. All of this incredible progress was kinda only possible in urban areas. It was happening inside the higher class, educated, elite little bubble in Kabul. But out in the rural fields, the poor farmers and mountain villagers didn't see a single bit of that freedom, not really. For the women living in these remote mud brick villages, these new laws certainly weren't a lifeline. They were actually more like a danger in a way. A queen tearing off her veil in a Kabul palace meant nothing to a girl working the fields under a scorching Afghanistan sun. No police officer or government judge was coming out into the mountains to guarantee her new rights. In fact, the king's laws actually made life more perilous for the rural women. And this is because, by banning bride prices and outlawing the practice of trading daughters to settle debts, the government accidentally bankrupted the traditional family economy. In this rural system, where families relied on these transactions just to buy food and survive, daughters were suddenly seen as financial liabilities. Because these girls couldn't read, had no schools to go to, and had zero ways to earn their own money, they remained completely trapped. They were still entirely at the mercy of their fathers and brothers. Only now, those men were angry, broke, and resentful of the government's interference. Now, in a perfect world, if the king truly wanted these human rights laws to stick, he would have had to give these families an alternative way to survive. You cannot simply outlaw a starving family's desperate source of income without giving them a backup plan. If the government had built rural trade networks, subsidized farming tools, or created financial safety nets to balance out the sudden loss of bride prices, no matter how terrible they are, the tribes might not have seen these laws as an attack on their very survival. But the king didn't do that. He handed down moral decrees from his palace in Kabul, offered zero financial compensation to the countryside, and left rural families to either break the law or starve. The massive disconnect between the city and the countryside is exactly what sparked the explosive tribal rebellion of 1928. To the rural tribes, the king was a godless dictator, destroying their way of life and taking their money. By January 1929, the pressure was too much. King Amanullah and Queen Soraya were forced to pack their bags and flee the country into permanent exile. Stepping into this gaping new power vacuum was a figure named Habibullah Kalakani, famously known as the Bandit King, or Bakka-e-Sakao, which translates to the water carrier's son. I apologize to anyone listening who knows I'm totally butchering these names. Sorry about that. Anyway, the Bandit King was a highly conservative, illiterate tribal rebel who immediately tore down every single one of Amanullah's reforms. He closed the girls' schools, forced women back into total isolation, and made the veil mandatory again. And so, the pendulum swung back towards rural rule. But the Bandit King didn't last long. He ruled for just 9 chaotic months before he was overthrown and executed by a powerful military general named Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah took the crown, starting a new royal dynasty, but he didn't really do anything notable for women, or anyone else for that matter. completely terrified of another rural rebellion. When he was assassinated a few years later, his 19-year-old son, Zahir Shah, became the new king. He spent the next few decades moving at an absolute snail's pace to keep the peace. For the generation of women living through the next few decades under King Zahir Shah, life remained as two entirely different worlds, dictated once again by geography and class. Out in the royal provinces, the clock kinda stopped. For 40 years, rural women lived under the exact same feudal conditions their grandmothers had endured. Completely isolated inside their family compounds, barred from education, and ruled by the strict laws of family honor. They survived by working the fields, maintaining the households, and passing down their landai poems from one woman's mouth to another woman's ear, just to keep their inner worlds alive. For them, all the monarchy meant was an engraving on a coin. But in Kabul, the king was in it for the long haul, still moving forward with progress, but oh so slowly. After having watched his father get assassinated, Zahir Shah knew he shouldn't rock the boat due to the volatile vibe of the country. If he forced change on the countryside, the tribes would surely burn down the cities. A bit later, though, by 1959, the king and his somewhat progressive prime minister, who also happened to be his cousin, Mohammed Daoud Khan, made a move. Instead of banning the veil outright like the previous exiled king had done, they simply made it optional. This voluntary approach completely transformed the lives of urban women. By the 1960s and 70s, a new generation of Afghan women were attending Kabul University, working as doctors, nurses, and teachers. For these city women, this 40-year window was like a golden era of possibilities. Now, if you Google history articles about Afghanistan, it is within this time frame that those famous photographs come from. You know, the ones people share on social media to show what the country used to look like. You see black and white snapshots of smiling women walking through Kabul in high heels and mini skirts and other Western fashion. But looking at these photos and thinking they represent the whole country is a massive misconception. That visual progress was an exclusive luxury for the people living in the urban areas. Out in the rural provinces, life was still exactly as brutal and locked down as it had been for centuries before King Amanullah ever took the throne. It was a deeply unfair kind of lottery of birth. If you were a girl born into rural poverty, no one was coming to rescue you, build you a school, or tell you that you could take off the veil. You were stuck. So while those vintage photographs of Kabul represent a beautiful era of genuine progress for a small population of city women, they also mask the tragic reality that millions of rural women were kind of left behind. But all of the sudden, the political ground began shifting. You see, the Prime Minister Daoud Khan wanted to drag the rest of the country into the modern world much faster than the cautious king wanted to allow. Sensing his cousin was becoming far too powerful and reckless, the king stripped Daoud of his prime minister title in 1963, passing a law that banned members of the royal family from holding political office altogether. It was a direct move to sideline his cousin. For a decade, Daoud bided his time in the background. Then, in 1973, while King Zahir Shah was away in Italy receiving medical treatment, Daud made his move. He orchestrated a non-violent coup. And so, the centuries-old monarchy was dead, and Afghanistan was declared a republic, with Daud at the helm. At first, things under Daud seemed to resume with a sense of control. His approach to transforming society was famously summed up by his own motto, Qadam bi Qadam, or step by step. He knew he was dealing with an intensely conservative country, so he deliberately kept a cautious pace. But make no mistake, he was still moving much faster than his cousin, the king. For urban women, the social landscape had already begun expanding during his earlier stint as prime minister in 1959, when he pushed through the voluntary lifting of the veil and the end of female seclusion in towns. Under his new republic, women increasingly walked the streets and worked in state offices in cities like Kabul. But as per what seems to be the usual, while the cities felt some sense of modernization, rural life stayed deeply traditional and pretty much untouched. So this reality brings the opportunity to speak about what Sharia law really is and how it handled everyday life. It was actually understood to be the law of the land back then, and it also seems to change, sometimes significantly, whenever the pendulum swings between modernization and uprising. Standard traditional Sharia law, as it was historically used in the countryside, was actually a much more tame, predictable framework for civil society. For everyday Afghans, it wasn't necessarily about a political ideology. It was just the baseline legal system that handled order in everyday life, things like marriages, divorces, inheritance, and business transactions. But let's not get it twisted here. Even traditional Sharia law was heavily patriarchal and very much weaponized against women. Under the standard system, a husband could decide to dissolve the marriage without needing any legal grounds. He just had to notify his wife and wait that mandatory 3-month period, and it was final. But for a woman, it was a near impossibility. She had to go before a male judge and prove her right to separate under very strict rules. This type of jurisprudence ran on a specific branch of Sharia called Hanafi jurisprudence. The everyday reality of Hanafi law was a dead end for women trying to survive a bad marriage. For instance, if a man abandoned his wife, the law basically said that she had to wait until his 90th or 120th birthday before she could officially get a divorce. The attempt at change for this system happened right at the start of Daud's republic because of a woman named Aziza. She was trapped in a dangerous situation. Her husband, Goth, was suffering from a severe permanent mental illness, or what the legal documents called permanent insanity. Aziza went to the courts begging for a judicial separation, explicitly telling the judges that cohabitation with him was a direct threat to her physical safety. But the primary court threw her case completely out because under strict Hanafi rules, mental illness wasn't on the narrow, approved list of reasons that allowed a woman to leave. Aziza's case caused a massive uproar among Afghanistan's modernists, forcing the Supreme Court and the Ministry of Justice to intervene. They seemed to finally realize the system was locking women into intolerable situations. So, while Daud was still firmly at the helm in 1977, a new civil code was pushed through. the rigid Hanafi rules were basically bypassed, and a much more open system from a different school of Islamic law began being used, just so women could finally, technically, ask a court for a divorce if they were being beaten, abused, or abandoned. Yet even with these new laws on the books, the bias remained. A woman could report abuse, but judges would routinely demand independent eyewitnesses to the violence. If a guy was beating his wife at 10 o'clock at night inside their home, how was she supposed to produce eyewitnesses? And it was also like a trap to attempt to get a divorce on grounds of something like sexual assault, because if you didn't have the witnesses, the judge could turn around and accuse you of adultery, which carries an enormous punishment, not to mention stigmatization. If a woman somehow managed to get out, she faced an incredibly high risk of being completely ostracized and cast out by her own family and community to protect the family's honor. Women were never really left with any good choices, even as the cities were supposedly modernizing. But now, back to Daoud and his step-by-step approach. It seemed it wasn't fast enough for everyone, especially when it came to the local Marxist factions, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. They didn't think Daoud was moving anywhere near fast enough, as far as modernization goes. Tensions boiled over in April 1978, after a prominent leftist figure was murdered. Fearing Daoud was about to entirely wipe out their leadership, the Marxists struck first. They launched a military takeover known as the Sour Revolution. They cornered Daoud in the presidential palace, and when he refused to surrender, they executed him alongside 17 members of his family. The regime that took over was largely dogmatic. Unlike Daoud's cautious gradualism, as it's called, these new leaders favored a total top-down enforcement of Marxist-Leninist ideals with absolutely no alternatives. They wanted to completely dismantle what they viewed as backward Afghan customs overnight. They immediately implemented radical top-down decrees trying to completely upend traditional marriage structures by legally abolishing traditional bride prices down to a much smaller sum. Now, again, this might sound like progress, but regardless, it completely backfired, and these guys were pretty terrible. As previously discussed, in rural villages, the bride price was a central economic income that families relied on, and it provided a built-in type of financial insurance policy for a woman in case of divorce. The communist decree completely ignored that and offered absolutely nothing to replace it. And the hypocrisy of this takeover was pretty bonkers. These militants claimed to be champions of the common people, yet they had almost no real understanding of their own rural society. Because of that, they relied heavily on hardcore intimidation. They sent young, aggressive party cadres from the cities out into the villages to enforce these rules, sometimes literally at gunpoint. If local elders or mullahs resisted, they were brutally beaten, their houses were pillaged, and their religious books were burned. Instead of mobilizing the poor, it united whole rural communities in utter rage against what they saw as an atheist government occupying their land. The chaos extended into the cities too. The regime actively rounded up, tortured, and/or executed thousands of intellectuals and professional class citizens. Basically, anyone they deemed as an enemy of the state. They even arrested entire families. In fact, they locked up 74 royal women and children under incredibly harsh prison conditions at Pul-e-Sharki that permanently shattered the health of many of them. before eventually exiling them under intense international pressure. But if we want to see just how chaotic and unstable this regime truly was, we have to look at the absolute madness happening at the very top between its two key leaders, Nur Mohammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin. Amin was incredibly bloodthirsty, aggressively pushing for maximum terror to force the country into complete compliance. Yet behind the scenes, dude was paranoid as fuck. By September 1979, the two turned on each other. Amin overthrew Taraki and had him secretly murdered, literally suffocated to death with a pillow. Amin took control, declaring that the only thing the Afghan people recognized was extreme force and violence. This is where the story gets even wilder. The Soviet Union watched their puppet state descend into utter chaos under Amin and decided he was entirely unhinged. They wanted him gone. The Soviets actually plotted to poison Amin during a lunch, and the poison was effective. Amin collapsed and went unconscious. But the Soviet plotters hadn't told the doctors at the Soviet embassy in Kabul what they were doing. These doctors rushed in and did their jobs and saved Amin's life, completely unaware that their own government was trying to assassinate him. Realizing the covert poisoning failed, the Soviets decided they had no choice but to launch a full-scale military invasion in late 1979. They sent in the KGB and special forces to storm the palace, and this time they made sure they finished the job, executing Amin and replacing him with a new premier. When the country inevitably went into a full-blown civil war following the Soviet invasion, the tactics used against the population became even more horrific. Soviet forces and the local secret police began targeting women directly. Russian troops flying in helicopters would actively scan fields for village women working without men nearby, land the helicopter, and kidnap them right out of the fields. They did the same thing in the streets of Kabul after dark, taking young women away in tanks and armored vehicles. The primary object of these abductions was rape, and many of these women were murdered afterwards. But even if they survived and were let go, a completely different nightmare began at home. In this way, the gap between rural and urban women meant very little, because the devastating weight of traditional family honor applied to both. In a society governed by strict tribal codes, an abducted and assaulted woman faced massive domestic stigmatization. She was instantly shunned, exiled, and treated by her own community as if she were the perpetrator who brought shame to the family. Tragically, many of these survivors faced the ultimate horror of honor killings, being stoned or murdered by their own relatives just to erase the perceived stain on the family name. But these women were far from just passive victims. Even in the face of absolute terror, a powerful underground women's resistance movement formed. Facing threats of arrest and execution, urban women organized covert networks. They risked so much by writing and distributing shabnama, or night letters. These were anti-regime and anti-Soviet resistance posters and flyers that women would silently paste onto neighborhood doors and walls under the cover of night, keeping the spirit of defiance alive and mobilizing civilian opposition when public protest could mean death. Tragically, the occupying forces met this defiance with indiscriminate terror, and perhaps the most sinister weapon of the entire occupation, which was the widespread deployment of scatterable mines, the Soviet military laid down countless PFM-1 plastic mines, famously known as butterfly mines. This was due to their curved, wing-like shape, which was engineered so that they could glide safely to the ground when dropped from aircraft. But because they were manufactured in bright green, blue, and white plastics, they looked exactly like playthings to a child. Children would spot them lying in the dirt, think they were toys, and pick them up, only to be blown up or permanently maimed. Most historians say that it was a deliberate strategy of terror, designed to break the psychological spirit of the population, and it also left deep trauma on generations of Afghan families. So how did this massive Soviet occupation actually come to an end? It wasn't through a traditional battlefield victory. Instead, it was a war of attrition. The Afghan resistance fighters, called the Mujahideen, which is a broad term to describe any resistance fighter really, deliberately chose a strategy to make the entire country completely ungovernable and also kind of unlivable. They used classic guerrilla tactics, cutting off supply lines and launching hit-and-run attacks that made it impossible for Soviet military to establish real control outside the major towns. And they, of course, had massive help. Hating the Soviet Union and wanting to push back against communist expansion, here came the United States and also Saudi Arabia, who poured billions of dollars in cash and weapons right into the resistance. Almost all of this support was funneled directly through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, which managed the logistics on the ground. By 1989, faced with mounting casualties and relentless international pressure, the Soviet Union threw in the towel and completely withdrew their troops. But there was utter destruction and hopelessness in the Soviets' departure. The Mujahideen had successfully created an ungovernable state to drive the Russians out. But once the common enemy was gone, they had no idea how to actually rule. By 1992, the remaining communist proxy government collapsed, and the various Mujahideen factions and warlords immediately turned on each other. This happened because of differences in ethnic and tribal lines, and that inability to find a common ground plunged the country into a devastating civil war. Warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the guy we spoke about in the beginning of the episode, backed heavily by Pakistan, literally blew up civilian areas of their own capital, tearing Kabul apart in a desperate power grab. This era of civil war became an absolute nightmare for everyday citizens. There were no functioning government departments, no police, and absolutely no system of justice. The southern region around Kandahar, in particular, became a lawless landscape of atrocities and crime, driven by complex tribal rivalries. Under the rule of these corrupt local warlords, horrifying human rights abuses became rampant. Warlords and their armed bands began now blatantly practicing bakabatsi, as we talked about earlier, aggressively kidnapping young boys from local families and subjecting them to sexual slavery. They were targeting women and young girls as well, treating the population with a level of cruelty that made survival a daily challenge. With all of this absolute chaos and devastation that was happening under the warlords, a new force began to make its appearance. They called themselves the Taliban, which in the Pashto language literally translates to students. Now, these were not the type of students you or I might picture going to an ordinary university to study science, literature, or math. These were young men, many of them orphans, who had been forced to flee Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation and the subsequent civil war. They grew up in refugee camps along the Pakistan border and were educated in rural religious schools called madrasas. In these isolated schools, they were taught a deeply rigid and uncompromising interpretation of what's called Deobandi Sunni Islam, which heavily fused with ancient strict Pashtunwali tribal codes. To the exhausted people of Afghanistan, especially in the rural villages, the Taliban looked kind of like relief. They didn't see them as fundamentalist extremists, not at first. They saw them as an answer to their prayers for simple law and order. The country had been completely broken by years of war, and people just wanted the violence and the explosions to stop. Leading this movement was a one-eyed village cleric named Mullah Muhammad Omar, and his rise to power is surrounded by a lot of lore. As legend has it, the turning point for Mullah Omar came in 1994 in Kandahar, when a local warlord kidnapped 2 teenage girls, shaved their heads, and brought them to a military camp to be repeatedly assaulted. Outraged by the lawlessness, Mullah Omar gathered a small group of about 30 students, armed with just a few rifles, and attacked the camp. They rescued the girls and publicly hanged the warlord from the barrel of a tank. Another version of the lore says that he did the exact same thing to a warlord who had kidnapped a young boy to assault him, because the exploitation of both women and young boys by the Mujahideen was rampant, so both versions worked. There were several other versions too, but who knows if any of them were real. This myth of the Taliban as Robin Hood-style liberators who executed rapists and cleared corrupt checkpoints made them incredibly popular, incredibly fast. But the reality of what they were bringing was not justice. It was total subjugation, as everyone is pretty well aware of. To understand the mindset of the regime that was about to swallow the country whole, you have to look at one of their earliest mottos. Reason can be thrown to the dogs. It stinks of corruption. The Taliban is actually populists, amongst other horrible things. And it is with the beginning of the Taliban's swift takeover of the country and how it will affect women that we will pick back up with on part 2. Please, please, please check out those 2 different links in the show notes to sign the petitions that will help the UN and the United Nations recognize what's happening in Afghanistan as a gender apartheid. There will be other links there as well, along with the socials for the show, and it would be awesome if you followed the show on whichever platform you listen on. And I realize I'm asking a lot here, and I often hate to ask for follows and ratings, but if you could rate the show, feedback is always good. You guys are awesome for listening. Thank you for your continued support. And remember, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. Bye.